Good afternoon, everybody, and everybody who is looking at us virtually, and everybody who's in line, in the security line trying to get in, and everybody who will be watching us sometime soon on a cable network. So, I'm Jane Harman, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and today we are probing a very complicated issue that is, in my view, bedeviling policymakers in Washington and all over the world. And at least three parts of that problem are the U.S., China, and the 5G supply chain. The Wilson Center has just produced, let me get my prop. This is a prop, a spectacular policy brief by Melissa Griffiths, who's in the front row right here and whom you'll see in a little bit, which is entitled, There is More to Worry About Than Huawei. I think you get the gist of this, and she will explain in detail, but run, don't walk, to read this, to get this and read it. Meanwhile, what captures the attention around 5G is that China-based Huawei has led the way in developing the super-fast networks which will power self-driving cars, virtual reality, and other cutting-edge technology. Since Chinese companies are required by law to comply with information requests from Chinese intelligence services, U.S. officials are properly concerned that companies who want to incorporate this Chinese technology will end up compromising their data and the data of their users. Other ways it could be compromised too, and we'll talk about that. But a few more thoughts. While the mantra that defined the last decade of technological developments was move fast and break things, just a suggestion from here, maybe we should think about slow down and assess things. And I think that's what you'll hear today. You'll hear what is the problem and what are some policy solutions that will help solve at least a part of the problem. Fortunately, the Wilson Center offers policymakers and their staffers the tools to assess new technologies like 5G and the implications for national security. For the Luddites in the room, if there are any, I doubt it, our audiences are always smart, we have given around 400 staffers from Capitol Hill, from nearly 300 offices on Capitol Hill, a foundation in technical skills through our bipartisan, bicameral, cyber and AI boot camps or labs that take place each Friday. Those boot camps are part of our Science, Technology, and Innovation program, which is brilliantly led by Meg King, who is probably hiding in the hall somewhere. Is Meg here? She's outside. Oh, she's hiding in the corner. That's where she is. But she directs our so-called STIP program, Science, Technology, and Innovation program, where these labs are housed. And overall, 800 Hill staffers have come here on Fridays. The others have gone to our Foreign Policy Fellowship program so that they can learn foreign policy as well as we can teach it. Today, we are talking about one problem that we have talked about much here, but we are delighted to welcome the man with the plan, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. The last time I saw Ajit was in the Hamptons in a warmer period of this year and possibly less hectic than the one we are in now. But we participated in a panel, and I learned a lot, and we discussed his coming here. And guess what happened? He is the first FCC chairman to go viral. That's cool. Often appearing in videos where he embraces internet memes while announcing new policies. That is really cool. He joined the Federal Communications Commission in 2012, appointed by President Obama for a 5-year term. In 2017, he was designated as chairman by President Trump. Good. Bipartisan. Love it. He has also worked at the DOJ, U.S. Senate, and the FCC's Office of General Counsel, and in the private sector at Verizon. Today, he joins me to discuss a proposal, actually two, which the commission will vote on Tuesday. I won't summarize what they are because he will tell us what they are. That's my first question. And following our conversation and audience questions, there will be a panel of really smart people who will introduce themselves joining us. And one of those, I've already told you, is the author of this amazing science, technology, innovation program. I guess, what do we call this, Meg? Policy brief. Okay. So I'm going to sit down now that I've introduced Ajit, and we're going to have a short conversation, so get your brilliant questions ready. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, the first question is a surprise question. The FCC is proposing 2 rules. What are they?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. Before I answer it, though, I do want to express my gratitude to the Wilson Center for hosting this important conversation. Obviously, the center has been the locus of some of the most important policy discussions here in Washington. And in my view, of course, I don't think there is much more important than this. I also want to thank you personally for your leadership in Congress over the years. Having viewed you from afar, I found consistently on the House Intelligence Committee, as well as the other legislative assignments you had, that you always discharged your responsibilities with a sense of bipartisanship and a focus on the national interests as opposed to the narrow partisan interests of the times. And I think
back at you. Thank you.
Very much appreciate that. I also will say on a personal note, I always feel like I've been chasing you. We actually share, as you might be aware, the distinction of having both served as the chief counsel of the subcommittee on the Constitution in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, obviously, you've gotten to much higher ground than I have, but I feel like I have a little bit of chasing to do in order to keep up with you.
Who was your chairman when you did that?
So that was Sam Brownback at the time, the chairman. Former House member who you might have served with in the 1990s.
I did.
But this is a really important conversation. I guess the predicate question is often, what is 5G and why does it matter? In the United States, we have made it a national priority to lead in the development and deployment of 5G technologies because, as you pointed out, these technologies increasingly are going to transform American industries, from transportation to healthcare, from agriculture to education, manufacturing to shipping. And so we have done that at the FCC by implementing what I've called the 5G Fast Plan, a plan for facilitating America's superiority in 5G technologies. You can find out more details about the plan at fcc.gov/5G, but in a nutshell, that plan involves getting more spectrum into the commercial marketplace, getting more wireless infrastructure deployed, the small cells and the other infrastructure of the future, and also promoting more fiber deployment, which is critical for carrying this wireless traffic into the core of the network. I'd be happy to go into more detail on any of these components and what the metrics of success have been so far. But in a nutshell, we want to advance American leadership in 5G. Now, with this connected future, however, comes a major challenge, as you know well, Congresswoman, which is that the attack surface, so to speak, in terms of security is much greater. 5G will be unlike predecessor technologies like 4G and 3G in that these networks will be increasingly software defined as opposed to defined by hardware, and that software could be located anywhere in the world. In addition to that, because we're talking about billions more connected devices coming online, it won't just be phones, it'll be everything from refrigerators to cars. We need to ensure that security protocols are thought of upfront as opposed to after the fact. And so the United States government's position overall, and the FCC's in particular, is that we need to think about 5G security now at the early stages of deployment, and as opposed to afterward when retrofitting might be prohibitively expensive, if not impossible. So what is the FCC doing to accommodate this interest? Well, 2 things. As you pointed out, we'll be voting this coming week on a proposal that is both forward-looking and backward-looking. The forward-looking component involves what is known as our Universal Service Fund. This is about a $9 billion annual capital expenditure fund that the FCC oversees, and the money from that fund is distributed to telecom companies across the country, primarily to deploy broadband infrastructure in rural areas and underserved areas. One of the things that we propose to do going forward is to prohibit the use of that funding from being used by recipients on equipment or services that have been determined to present a national security threat to the United States. And based in part on legislation passed by Congress on a bipartisan basis last year, the National Defense Authorization Act, we include as an initial designation both Huawei and ZTE as companies that would be on the so-called prohibited list in terms of the ways that companies could use this money. That's the forward-looking component. The backward-looking component is to say, we understand that there may be problematic equipment already in our networks, and 4G networks in particular. So we're starting a conversation about understanding where that equipment might be, who is using it, what it's being used for, et cetera. And then also to kickstart a conversation about how do we finance the removal and the replacement of that equipment, especially to the extent that we are talking about rural carriers disproportionately that have incorporated some of this problematic equipment. They might not have the resources on their own to be able to do that. And so in consultation with them, members of Congress and others, we want to make sure that we have an accurate sense of where we are right now. So it's that forward-looking and backward-looking set of proposals that we'll be voting on next week.
And what's the prognosis for that vote? Will it pass?
I certainly hope it will on a bipartisan basis. I know that this is a time in which the political environment has become increasingly tribalized, but I do think that when it comes to our national security, we do speak with a unified voice. And my expectation, based on some of the conversations I've had with my colleagues, is that we will see a very strong bipartisan vote next week. And that's certainly what we've seen in terms of letters coming from Congress. We've seen members from both sides saying, look, we support your efforts in this regard.
So, basically, this is using a U.S. fund as the leverage to get companies to do something on a forward-looking basis and then on a backward-looking basis to trade in technology they may already have purchased, because there is Huawei technology in the United States already, right?
That's correct.
For non-Huawei, non-Chinese technology. But the rest of the world's out there. I mean, is this... How do you see this in the context of a world where Huawei technology is available just about everywhere, and certainly not just here?
That's a great question, and that's part of the reason why over the last several months I've been very involved, not just domestically, but with some of my counterparts across the United States government in going to other countries and representing the views of the United States government on these issues. And not just with respect to that company. We recognize that the risk profile applies to any company. We want to understand what the risk framework is for any company that is putting incredibly important equipment and services into our networks. So our message to our allies, when I've traveled through the Middle East, through Europe, elsewhere, has been we want to make sure that we all have a common understanding of what the risk is, what the best strategy to mitigate the risk might be, and how we can work together to share information about how that risk may be materializing. And that's been a conversation that is ongoing, but we've had very positive feedback so far.
Well, I would guess everybody agrees about the problem. Everybody wants to manage risk. But I would doubt, just based on what I read, and I know much less about this than you do, that there are different strategies and that some countries are going to go ahead and either keep or buy Huawei technology. Is that fair?
I think there are some countries that are exploring different strategies from the United States, and our message is pretty consistent that to the extent that you agree with the security assessment, we, of course, respect your right to make whatever decision you want, but speaking as the United States, we do not believe that this is an area where we can take a risk and hope for the best. Given how transformative 5G technologies are likely to be, the United States, at least, wants to make sure that 5G security is a forethought as opposed to an afterthought, and that we think very carefully about the risk profile of any equipment coming into our networks.
I certainly think that's a worthy objective, but I can imagine another government saying to you, okay, yes, we're worried about the risk profile, but our answer to that is we will make sure that our systems, and you've mentioned that these are software-based systems, 5G, unlike prior systems, and Melissa's paper helped me understand what the difference is. No easy point of intersection where you can block bad guys from coming in. No spoke of the wheel. Did I get this right? Yes, I'm learning. But even so, what about the answer that says we're worried about this, we're going to fight intrusion, but we think even if we don't buy Chinese-made technology, there could be intrusion from others. And so our theory of the case is we'll just fight intrusion, whether it's using Huawei technology or not.
So I offer several responses to that. First, of course, we embrace a risk-based framework, as I said, applicable to any supplier of equipment for 5G network equipment or services. But the question is one of the degree of risk. And you pointed out in your opening remarks, I think quite accurately, that to the extent China has a national intelligence law that compels any company subject to its jurisdiction to comply with requests from the Chinese intelligence services, and also prohibits that company from disclosing the fact of the request to a third party, such as customers of Huawei, for example, in China or abroad, that presents a serious risk. Additionally, the question is one of the ability of the host government to be able to detect some of these risks in real time. As Ms. Griffiths' paper points out very well, I think, we're talking not just about a wireless tower that needs to be upgraded. We're talking about software that needs, over time, millions of lines of code to update it. And any one of those lines that is malicious could be a vector for including malware and viruses. Does any government have the ability to police in real time all of those lines of code? And the third point, this is related
I assume the answer to that is no.
We certainly believe that the risk is too great, that it is just beyond the scope of most government's ability to police. And the third and final point, which is related to something that we often hear, is, well, that equipment is significantly cheaper. And the argument I make on that point is sometimes the only problem with cheap is that it ends up costing too much. And not just in terms of our security risk, which is something that is very difficult to put a value on, but even on its own terms, even if something is 50% cheaper or 80% cheaper, over time, once you're locked into a particular vendor, and that vendor has software that is buggy, or there are backdoors you have to police, or other kinds of problems, over time, you will end up paying the price for making a decision at the beginning. So we don't want any country, certainly not our own, to be penny wise and pound foolish when it comes to this particular question.
Well, I get that, and I think other countries will have to think about that. But if as I understand it, again from reading this very learned policy paper, the Huawei software is buggy. What a great word, buggy. Is that an official word?
I think it's a technical term that we...
Technical term, buggy. Wouldn't anybody's software be possibly buggy, even if it's more expensive?
Our view is that it's a difference in kind. If you look at sources not based on the U.S. government, look at the UK's a cybersecurity report, for example, look at some of the independent researchers who have examined some of the software and equipment, we do think that there is a difference in kind. And again, even if there were parity, then the question is, what is the risk? And given the national legal framework that is in place in China in particular, we do have concerns that both with the national intelligence law, the lack of an independent judiciary, and the general willingness of the Chinese government to exert its leverage that we've seen in this country just over the past month over things like basketball and the Taiwanese flag emojis and the like for iPhone users in Hong Kong and Macau, we do have concerns that the Chinese government would behave strategically in this particular area. Okay,
so what if you succeed? Good luck to you. I mean, if this is adopted and you succeed, and then one of the, Wilson Center geniuses goes over to China and forgets to take his burner phone and takes his regular phone, pure, no Chinese-based technology in the phone, and then it's compromised in China. Then what?
This is one of the concerns we have whenever I travel abroad myself. I'm given a briefing by our great team about cyber hygiene and the like, and so we certainly would encourage any United States citizen traveling under color of the U.S. government or not to take those adequate precautions. And we work with our State Department, our Department of Homeland Security, the National Security and Intelligence Community agencies, and others to make sure that whenever we go abroad, we're taking the steps necessary to protect ourselves and our fellow citizens.
But, I mean, mistakes are made. They just always are made. And so even with the purest of intentions and the purest of technology, it still could be compromised by the Chinese, and then or pick another country.
Yeah,
and we still could end up with bugs, defects, workarounds, whatever that we didn't intend. Right? So
absolutely. And so that's why I think issues like cyber hygiene are not just limited to the FCC. It's a cross-governmental effort. And I think it's important for anybody traveling abroad, not just to China, just anywhere, to be aware of what devices you're using. Basic things like don't accept a zip drive and plug it into your computer, no questions asked. I mean, you'd be surprised.
I'm not surprised.
I've heard and seen it all. And just the basic things that I think technology, as it evolved over the last 20 years, as you know better than anybody, coming from one of our most innovative states, it was evolved based on this
That's
open.
California. For
Oh,
those
sorry.
who
Yes.
don't know that.
But I think we got used to this being a very open, positive platform,
Right.
and we need to think about some of the potential risk factors when we're all interconnected like this too.
But I'm just making the point, and this is true in the whole security landscape. There's no such thing as 100% security.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's a question of mitigating risk as best we can.
So speaking of this, I serve on the Defense Policy Board. I've been to a number of briefings at the Pentagon, very worried about this. And
yes.
we've got to get Chinese-made technology totally out of the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. What if we achieve this and we have a a Chinese technology-free situation and everybody observes good cyber hygiene, right? Everybody does. I'm looking at everybody. And we're all happy campers. And then the rest of the world doesn't play. And so they basically operate the rest of the world on different technology. How does that make us more secure?
It is a problem to the extent that we are interconnected. Networks don't know or respect national boundaries, as nation states would, of course. And so we need to take steps to ensure that we do protect ourselves. And so from the FCC perspective, for instance, earlier this year, we denied the application of China Mobile to enter the United States market based on the opinion of the the intelligence community and others that the entry of that company would present a risk. And so we've taken steps like that to make sure that we keep the homeland secure as best we can. And going forward, as I said, I've been talking to some of our counterparts around the world, from Brazil to India, from Israel to Germany, about the need for us to collaborate on some of these issues, because we recognize that the United States does not exist in a digital vacuum.
Right.
We need to be able to have not just trusted vendors, but strong allies as well going forward.
But as unsophisticated as I am about this, and I really am unsophisticated, I think about developments in the intel world that I had some role in, such as insisting that our analysts look at open source intelligence. Open source means stuff that is published and available, not classified. And if we're in our little, balkanized world and we only have access through our equipment to some part of all this and the rest of the world's out there, how do we maximize the use of open source intelligence?
It's a critical question. I will simply say for my part, I engage vigorously not just in the classified briefings that are forwarded to agency officials like me, but also, as you pointed out, some of the information that's simply out there. I mean, just look at the last week alone. We were talking beforehand about Senator Schumer's recent letter to the Army about TikTok, so some of the other things that are bubbling up in the news. I think many Americans aren't fully aware of how mobile payments in China, for example, which is another industry that's evolved very, very quickly. I think we're still accustomed to pulling plastic out of our wallets and purses, whereas in China, that's the anomaly. So we need to understand where the Chinese are, where the Chinese marketplace is generally, in addition to the direct spending that we've discussed before, that the Chinese government is doing on things like artificial intelligence and machine learning and blockchain and quantum computing. Even if it doesn't directly impact 5G security, I think it's important to have a holistic view. And from my perspective, I don't care where that information comes from as long as it's credible. We want to learn both on a classified and unclassified basis what the state of play is.
China is a strategic competitor. That's what our national security strategy says, and I agree with that. But that doesn't mean an enemy. And if we say, go away, China, we don't want your stuff, we don't want to deal with you, does that help us? Is that the best approach to achieving our national security goals? Or is an alternative saying, understanding China better than we do? And that's something Robert Daly, who heads our Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S., is trying to do. And notice in the name of that institute, it's China and the U.S. It's not the other way around. Mm-hmm. We do think understanding China matters. So if understanding China and trying to find ways to work with China to the extent we can is a good idea, is a policy like the one you're going to vote on in a week in that direction, or is it in the other direction? Well,
certainly I would defer, of course, to the State Department on the broader diplomatic community on setting the overall policy with respect to China. For the FCC's perspective, at least, we think it is a constructive way forward, simply to say we want to have a risk-based framework for understanding equipment or services from any country or company that come into our networks. And we always are looking to engage constructively on issues where we can collaborate and where there is a strategic issue at play. we want to address it very thoughtfully, not in a knee-jerk fashion.
But it just occurs to me, I just have a couple more questions and we'll go to the audience. Even if your rules are adopted, the leverage you have is money. And if is it possible for people to say, I don't want your money, I will use private sector money, or I will borrow from somewhere else, some other country even, to do what I was intending to do. So your rule won't apply to me. And retroactively, you're using money as the lever to get equipment to be changed. What if people say, again, I don't want to change my equipment. I'm not going to comply, or I'm going to find other financing and take out your money.
Thus far, we have not heard concerns along those lines from particular carriers or groups, but to the extent that any entity or trade association or the like has concerns, especially when it comes to financing, we're always happy to engage in that conversation. That's part of the reason why, as part of that backward-looking proposal that I talked about, we are engaged with Congress on finding a financing mechanism to see whether or not some of the concerns that they have might be addressed in that regard.
Well, a comment on our mutual former employer. The nuanced knowledge of China could be increased there, just a thought. And I'm glad you're in the position you are because you're smart and you have that background. And,
Far too kind. Thank you.
And the Wilson Center is also poised to try to teach the technology and teach the understanding so that instead of just demonizing a country or a person, and a lot of personal demonizing goes on in Congress too, we can urge people to understand better and provide nuanced policy options. And I think that's where we're all trying to get. Am I right?
I couldn't agree more. And I think I personally have tried to learn as much as I can. Having traveled to China before, as I mentioned before, my Putonghua is very limited, but San I can get through. But generally speaking, I think it's important for us to learn not just about China in this particular vector, but just generally speaking, the history of the place, what motivates them, what makes them tick. I appreciate, obviously, the diversity of the country itself, having been to Beijing and Kunming and Chongqing, Wuhan, and these other places. And so I know that it's, obviously, there are differentiations there that we need to take account of.
And last thing, because you mentioned it, was cost. I mean, everybody gets it that the Huawei products in particular are much less expensive and ubiquitous. Isn't there something we could do to challenge this through the WTO? And are we thinking about that?
I have expressed concerns that the Chinese government does directly subsidize Huawei and other like companies. And it seems fairly clear that by doing that, number one, they've made a strategic determination that they should have national champions. Number two, that those national champions should compete on the international stage using subsidies. And number three, that to the extent possible, they should be able to block out foreign competition. And whether that is a violation of WTO rules, I would defer to the trade lawyers, of course, but I'll simply say that it is clearly not something that we do in the United States. We don't have a domestic supplier of 5G equipment. It's primarily Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. So we're not looking to advance a parochial trade interest in that regard. And secondly, that's not the kind of thing the United States traditionally does. I mean, as you know well, Congresswoman, the FCC, other federal agencies like it, we see it as our role traditionally to set the building blocks for companies to innovate and invest around. And then we have more of a hands-off approach. We don't pick particular companies in a marketplace, subsidizing them, tell them go forth and conquer. And so that's just not something that we have traditionally seen in the marketplace of ideas internationally.
But I would just lament, as you said, that we don't have a domestic supplier. I gather Qualcomm does a little bit of this, but why don't we?
I think for some of the subcomponents, we do. Semiconductor, for example, we've historically had a strong place. Software, of course, is a key driver for some of these networks. So for some of the components that go into 5G networks, the equipment is used by Huawei and others, we do have an advantage. But for it's a much larger conversation, of course, but for a variety of reasons, the number of international suppliers has dwindled in recent years.
Well, boo on us. I mean, we are the innovators. We should be way ahead on this, and it makes me sad. I see people nodding. Okay, people, smart people, questions. Identify yourself and ask a question. Don't make a speech. And there was someone in the second row with his hand up.
And I'll try to do the same, by the way.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, Jim Saltis. Question about, no matter what we do, there's always going to be software that we can't trust in the routing of the network. But as agencies are using zero trust solutions to protect their data and also make sure that there's user-based access and not just based upon how the network routes it, wouldn't that be a good solution to make sure we're not, losing our data or intellectual property?
That's a good question. It's one of the things we're consistently, and I'm personally working with our information technology teams on is how do we make sure our own networks are as secure as possible? And so those zero trust solutions are some of the things that we've been exploring as well.
There was a question on the left along the aisle. Let's see. Who had a question? You did. Okay.
It's already known that in the technology, such as
identify yourself, please.
I'm the first-year student from Alice School of International Affairs here in DC. It's already known that in the 5G technologies, China is pretty high than the United States. And China now they officially announced that they will start development of 6G.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think U.S. should also develop a similar counterpart plan in here? And what's their implication to the U.S. national security?
Yeah.
A good question. So with respect to what the U.S. strategy is for 5G and how we match up vis-a-vis China, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we do have the 5G fast plan. I think the early metrics are good in the sense that we have freed up a tremendous amount of spectrum. Right. So, but simply to say, with respect to 5G, which was sort of the predicate for your question, I do think that we are stacking up very well. If you look at the amount of spectrum we freed up, the number of small cells we expect to have deployed, the amount of fiber deployed in 2018 was the largest. It's on record for homes and businesses in the United States. Now, going forward, of course, what are we thinking about with respect to 6G? We always, of course, have our eyes on the future, and so we're looking at that as well. But obviously, our primary focus at the moment is on making sure that we free up some of those building blocks for 5G. But I will say that one of the reasons why China has the ability to do that is, of course, they don't have, number one, the multiple layers of regulatory review that we have in the United States. We have federal review, state, local, and in some cases, any one of the 573 federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States can have a bite at the regulatory apple. And so one of the points I've been making consistently is that to the extent that the United States wants to lead in 5G, we need to have a consistent and level set of regulations that any company, large or small, but especially small, can innovate and invest around. The other issue is, of course, that China can simply fiat from Beijing of what the national priority is going to be. And of course, as it was publicly reported, they want 6G to be a driver for Chinese innovation in the future. And so I think we need to have a sense of mission in the United States about thinking about the technologies in the future. That's one of the reasons why last December, our agency became one of the first, in my understanding of it, the first ever in Washington to host a forum on artificial intelligence and machine learning, understanding what AI and machine learning is and how it is likely to affect adjacent technologies such as connected health, for example, or driverless cars. There's obviously more for us to do. There are many adjacent technologies, as I said, quantum and blockchain and many others bubbling up. But we need to have a strategic vision across government and with the private sector to understand what the potential is for some of these technologies.
But as I mentioned, we teach AI here. Isn't it premature, though, to be talking about 6G when we've barely started on 5G? I understand the EU also is talking about 6G. How many years or centuries, I guess the way data moves, it won't be centuries, but how many years off is a completed 5G network?
It will be several years. To be sure, the life cycle is going quicker. I'm old enough to remember 2G phones back in the 90s, and 4G developed starting around 2007 with the introduction of the smartphone and developed much quicker than I think many people anticipated. So we are in a much faster cycle, but nonetheless, I think we are in the very early stages of 5G development and deployment. So certainly the bulk of my attention, as I mentioned, has been focused on 5G.
Other questions? With the pink scarf right here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Ina Peltonen, working for Business Finland at the Embassy of Finland here in DC. Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, Chairman, for your discussion. I just would like to mention that it was Finland actually which organized the world's first 6G summit last March. And we are going to have 6G delegation in town next week. And there's already white paper, so if you want to read it, please check University of Oulu there you can find that white paper. But I would like to ask about the WRC. How do you see how is it going? And you visited also there, so I would like to hear your views about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. For those who are blissfully unaware, every 4 years, the International Telecommunications Union, which is essentially a branch of the United Nations, organizes a conference in which spectrum policies for the world are hashed out. And there's one ongoing right now, as Ms. Peltonen pointed out, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And so I spent the first week there in Egypt. I will say from the United States perspective, at least, while I was there, I felt like we were advancing the ball on some of the critical priorities of the United States government. For example, with respect to policies for the 24 gigahertz band, we were advocating very strongly for the U.S. government consensus position of minus 28 decibel watts as the appropriate level for protection of not just the passive weather sensors into the nearby 23.6 gigahertz band, but also the 5G development of the 24.25 and above gigahertz band. Similarly, with respect to Earth Stations in Motion, or eSIMs, we feel like the U.S. position is gaining support, and it is able to protect not just some of the geostationary satellite orbit constellations, but also some of the NGSOs that we think are going to be providing connectivity. Some of the other items that are under consideration, one thing I will flag is the 6 gigahertz band, which I proposed about 2 years ago to free up. This is 5925 to 7125 megahertz. I think those 160 megahertz wide channels, if made available to the commercial marketplace while protecting incumbents, in particular electric utilities, could allow American entrepreneurs and innovators to really make Wi-Fi pop. I mean, pretty much everyone in this room, I assume, is familiar with Wi-Fi. If you're bored with my remarks, you're probably feverishly looking for a Wi-Fi channel right now. But just imagine if we had up to six of these 160 megahertz channels available. Untold innovation and investment on things like AR and VR, even industrial IoT, low bandwidth, high bandwidth applications, you name it. So one of the things we want to do is to make sure that we highlight the importance of the 6 gigahertz band as well. But many other priorities at WRC, and we're in the early stages, but hopefully things will go well over the next several weeks. Sorry for the
well, not surprised to hear that Finland's leading the pack. We are great.
It's not enough that they have a great Winter Olympics team compared to ours. Now they have to go and focus on 6G as well.
That answer was daunting, and we're going to give a test on it as soon as this hour is over. And I'm going to be the first person to flunk the test.
Hey, nothing makes me cooler to party when you mention the word gigahertz. To try it out sometime. So.
Yeah, we'll all try it. Okay. More questions in the middle of the room. Wait. Microphone is coming.
Jordan Wilcox, Rand Corporation. My question is, do you feel that the threats posed by Huawei and ZTE devices have a parallel partner in Chinese or companies based in China and their data collection through devices of any kind in the United States? And if so, are you thinking about what could be done to monitor that?
It's a very good question. And I mentioned earlier the letter from Senator Schumer regarding TikTok. And we see now members of both parties in both houses of Congress expressing concern about applications, not just from China, but from other countries as well. FaceApp, for example, which is owned by a Russian company. There are other concerns that have been expressed about how data generated by American consumers on mobile platforms using some of these foreign-owned apps could be used or misused. And although the FCC does not directly exercise jurisdiction over companies like that, nonetheless, we are monitoring the situation because we understand that while from a consumer perspective, one app may not be any different from another, they just focus on the functionality of it. Nonetheless, the location of where that data is stored, the practices about regarding how that information is used, those are things that the United States government does need to take a look at. And so we work consistently, as I mentioned, among others, with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. The head of that, Chris Krebs, among others, and his team have been working on those issues, among others. And so as I said, we have a very close consultative relationship with them and others in this space.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we're going to move to our other panel. I'm trying to figure this out. 15 minutes or 0 minutes?
In the back?
I can't see that far. 5 minutes. Okay. Let's see. Kent Hughes.
I'm Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. In the mid-2017, President Trump directed the whole of government to take a look at the defense industrial base, including the civilian parts of the economy that contributed. Much of that's still classified. And it looked at several tiers of the supply chain. Are you using that information to alert CFIUS for the items that we have that we ought to protect, or to guide federal investment to try to plug the holes where they exist?
What I can say publicly is that we have taken account of that executive order along with the May 2019 executive order, and we, the FCC, are taking the appropriate steps based on the text of those orders. Is that oblique enough an answer?
But we're paying attention.
We are,
We're
yes.
doing? Yes,
yes.
that's not classified.
The cop is
but
on the
We are
beat,
paying
yes.
attention.
Exactly.
Okay. So a couple more questions. Where are you, smart people? Robert Daly, who heads our, what we call KICIS, the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S.
Thank you very much for your remarks and your discussion. This follows up on some of the things that Jane has already touched on. You said we need a sense of mission, a strategic vision. Part of this seems to be involve things like subsidies to poor communities to buy other equipment they couldn't otherwise get and to be hooked up. People like Senator Rubio have called for an American industrial policy. Why is there no American analog to Huawei? That, at least, is not Huawei's fault, right? So where I'm going with this is this seems to be pointing toward an industrial policy or perhaps violations of what is sometimes called market orthodoxy. And I've been in discussions with congressmen where we hit a wall at this point, where the answer to all of the concerns you've rightly raised seems to go against market orthodoxy, and the conversation stops there. Do we face such a problem? How do we resolve it?
That's a very good question. So certainly the concern about industrial policy is one that members of Congress have been debating, and there may be other administration agencies with equities there. From our perspective, at least at the FCC, we, of course, don't have the resources to come up with some sort of industrial policy along those lines. Our position is simply, let's have a risk-based framework for understanding the risk posed by any particular supplier and ensure that domestic recipients go with trusted vendors. If that trusted vendor happens to be in Finland or Sweden or Korea, we historically have been indifferent to. What we want is to make sure that the equipment or services that we're funding are ultimately trusted. Whether or not industrial policy is needed to rectify some of the larger market forces that have evolved over time, well before I got into this position, of course, these trends started, is something that I think members of Congress would have to engage with.
But there's a variation on that question. Innovation has been at the core of our free market success in this country, especially in California. Just point that out. But what happened to American innovation around 5G? Why are we behind? I think you would agree we're behind.
With respect to 5G, I actually don't think we are behind. If you look at some of the early markers, we're on track to have something like 92 commercial deployments in the United States by the end of this year. We're holding the largest spectrum auction in American history on December 10th. This is going to be 3,400 megahertz of millimeter wave spectrum. We've got many mid-band initiatives, 2.5, 3.5, 3.7. We're seeing American companies innovate. We're seeing new companies enter the space. We mentioned earlier in response to Ms. Pelton's question about space. I mean, space, although it's technically not thought of in the context of 5G, America really is leading when it comes to non-geostationary satellite orbit companies like SpaceX and OneWeb. These are American companies who are not just launching these small satellites that are going to provide connectivity at a speed and price point comparable to a terrestrial provider. They're also innovating on the launch side as well. I mean, the reusable rockets, those were developed here in the United States, in Southern California, as a matter of fact.
In my congressional district, SpaceX started there.
And I have to think
it's successful.
And I have to think it's due solely to the efforts of a particular congresswoman who happened to represent that area for a long time.
But my point is, you're talking about a lot of other stuff. When
Yeah.
you talk about the backbone, if software is a backbone of our next generation communications system for the entire world, and we are not the U.S. I mean, there are Western countries that are helping lead, but we are not the leader. It surprises me.
In terms of the equipment and services, yeah, there are other suppliers from around the world, and that's, that's just one of the things we've emphasized, as I said in our conversations with other countries. We're not looking to advance the pecuniary interest of a particular American company. This is a non-American supply chain that we're talking about at this point.
And also, just to close, because I think we're out of time. Am I right? We're out of time? Yes, we are. The innovation in America has come from a hugely diverse workforce.
Absolutely.
I mean, not everybody in America looks the same. And the immigrant, I would say, from my vantage point as someone who grew up in California and watches with sorrow, the fires, and all the other plagues of California at the moment. But the diversity in the workforce, for example, the Indian diaspora, just to pick one, has been extraordinary. And without those people, we might not have invented a lot of the stuff that we have. But in this area, we seem not to be as swift, with the exception of our FCC chairman, as we should be. Compliment back to you. So on that note, wouldn't you agree that this guy is trying his hardest across administrations to bring clarity and competence to government, and that this is an area that needs attention, and he's paying attention? And let's thank him for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And the test will start in 45 minutes. Meanwhile, we're having another panel that will show you how much more we even know about this topic. Please join us here. Okay. And our moderator will introduce himself and the panel.
Hello, and thanks for sticking around for the second part of this conversation. Really appreciate it. My name is Uri Berliner. I'm the senior business editor at NPR, and we've got a great panel here. They know a lot about this stuff, so we'll get started. Robert Daly is the director of Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. He served as a diplomat in Beijing, an interpreter for Chinese and American leaders, including President Carter and Henry Kissinger. He's been the head of China programs at Johns Hopkins, Syracuse, and the University of Maryland. And my favorite part of his bio, he was a producer of Chinese language versions of Sesame Street. He's widely recognized as an expert in U.S.-Sino relations and is lectured far and wide all over the place. Melissa Griffiths' work you've heard cited before. She is, her research deals with the intersection of security and technology and focuses a lot on national defense and cyberspace. She's worked in cybersecurity, transatlantic relations, and how small countries, small states can defend themselves in an increasingly dangerous digital world. She's a PhD candidate in political science at UC Berkeley and affiliated researcher at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Daniel Cruz is the Deputy Assistant Director at the National Risk Management Center, and he focuses on public-private partnerships to enhance cybersecurity and the resilience of critical infrastructure. His work also deals with efforts to manage risks in the global supply chain, something that was talked about earlier, and the security of 5G networks, which has been our primary topic today. Daniel was formerly chief of staff for Congressman John Ratcliffe, who was the chair of the, I'll get this right, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee, right?
Got it.
All right. Okay, good. With that, let's go. Melissa, why don't we start with you? Can we just talk a little bit about what the evidence is, what the record is of Huawei's behavior? Have they been a bad actor? Are there examples of them spying or allowing Chinese authorities to spy, or their equipment being used to hack? What's the record?
Yeah, so I think, is that on? So I think there's a bit of a mixed record. It's an area of hot debate on sort of how malicious Huawei has been in 5G. The area that's not up for debate is it's just really shoddy code, right? So I think regardless of whether you're concerned about them being a malicious actor, whether that's intentional or not, there are really big cavernous holes in their software and in their firmware on hardware devices. And that allows a malicious actor great opportunity to leverage those holes, including Chinese government, including Huawei, but also not limited to that, right? I think when we think a lot about security threats to the U.S. and other instances where we've had compromises, those haven't largely been through Chinese technology. That is notable. That has been by countries like North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, and they have been able to leverage existing holes, right, these vulnerabilities. So I think it's a mixed record about whether or not Huawei's building in intentional vendor-installed backdoors. You've probably seen a lot of op-eds on that. Whether or not they're operating a kill switch at any moment could turn off critical infrastructure. But the reality is their code allows for those things because it's pretty shoddy.
Daniel, it's, one thing that came up in the conversation with the chairman and the congresswoman was that 5G has a broader attack surface, which is kind of a scary idea, that it's much more vulnerable in many different ways. Can you talk about that a little bit and sort of what that raises about should we be rushing to adopt all this 5G technology with this very broad attack surface?
Yeah, well, the promise of 5G, as the chairman and others mentioned, is undeniable. You pick your sector of the economy, it'll fundamentally transform it and afford all sorts of opportunities that we've never seen before, trillions of dollars of economic opportunities. So we recognize the promise there. On the risk, security, and resilience side of the equation, there is a lot we still have to understand and contextualize about the risk. And I think the discussion we had earlier about largely software-defined networking versus 4G, where a lot of those functions that will be virtualized in 5G have not been in previous generations, that just adds millions of lines of code where we did not have it before. And when you look at the use cases of 5G, and the way it's going to matter for telemedicine and autonomous vehicles and the like, we're no longer just talking about a data integrity and privacy issue. We're actually talking about a public health and safety issue as well in terms of the use cases of how 5G could be leveraged or manipulated as well. And Melissa touched on some of the reporting of Huawei equipment and other telecommunications kit that comes from China. And I think a really telling report came out of the UK in their Huawei Cybersecurity Center, where they have done over a decade of what is post-deployment testing. And it was a really fascinating report where it laid out, and this is, because it's testing what's already in the field, it's testing 4G for the most part. And they said that they have only limited assurance of their ability to have a risk management schema there that gives them confidence, and also said that they have almost no ability to ensure binary equivalence, which means what they have spent enormous amount of effort and time and energy testing in the center, they're not actually sure that's what's deployed in the field. But that's just for 4G before you have a factor of 10 or 100x the amount of code. And so when you go from the current generation where we're not sure that we have any assurance that it's not a leaky product, and we don't even know what we're testing is what deployed, and then you go to the attack surface of the next generation, which is going to be orders of magnitude more code that's going to have monthly firmware updates itself, that whether or not it's an intentional backdoor or it's just an unintentional bug door, you sort of package that all together and the attack surface from this becomes enormous. And as came up in the previous conversation, there is no 100% perfectly safe, risk-free, vulnerability-free product. But recognizing that reality I just laid out, what all that means is you've got to have trust on the front end. If that's the reality we're dealing with millions of lines of code, you really can't enter that new world with that attack surface from a position of compromised trust.
Well, given that, Congresswoman Harman said maybe we should slow down and assess if 5G is with all the benefits, also a challenge, a threat to public health potentially because of the vulnerability. It's going to be embedded in our hospitals, in our transportation system. It's going to be in our homes, the connectivity. Does it make sense to secure the network first and then race to develop? Anybody jump in on that.
It may make sense to wait, but China certainly isn't waiting.
Yeah.
Not all of these qualms are here. So they're deploying very, very fast. On October 30th, just last week, they started full 5G programs in 50 different cities, Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, relatively cheaply, about $18 a month, US. Now, there's a glitch in the system that many people don't have 5G-capable phones yet, but they're getting them fairly quickly. I was just in Beijing last week, and the whole cityscape has been transformed by these massive towers, multiple input, multiple output antenna arrays are on rooftops all over Beijing. They, on November 5th, actually China using these arrays set a new 5G speed record for single cell phone users. And these arrays actually track individual phone users. So they're ready for you to sign on, and then they can jump on it and be even faster rather than the traditional 4G passive networks. So this is already happening. So even if we have these, bad code, many vulnerabilities, China's going to be learning this as they go in a nation of very early adopters. And they will adjust, right? They're going to be filling some of those gaps as they move. So there's a question here with 5G, how much of this is for innovation? And if it's about innovation and public welfare, then it might make sense to wait for the reason that you and Congresswoman Harman mentioned. Or is this about commercial dominance and ultimately about the balance of power? In which case, the first movers get a tremendous advantage because they're learning a lot. So I think this question is, what is the right framework? Is it our own national security and our vulnerabilities? Is this balance of power, or is this concerned about who's going to have the international champions, and we tend to confuse those different categories?
I would actually push back a little bit because I think we put a lot of emphasis on a first mover advantage in 5G. And this is the argument for speed, right? Is that if you're the first mover, you get a lot of practice, you get into markets earlier, you deploy much faster. It makes it harder for other companies or other competitors to slot in after you, right? And to do it in the same kind of quality. I don't think that's been borne out in telecommunications in general, right? A lot of the big dominant players in 4G were not the first movers. So I think there's a little bit of a false narrative, even if we're looking at these two as two separate, the geopolitical versus sort of social economic good of a country. I think we put a lot of weight on first mover that's not necessarily borne out kind of in history. I would also push and say we have a lot of good experience around cybersecurity more general and critical infrastructure that tells us it's a really terrible plan to chase a horse once it's left the barn, right? And you're trying to trace it down, sort of like, let's add some security here, maybe I can patch on some resiliency there, and the horse is just gone. And I think we are at a moment now where we do need to emphasize security just as much as speed. One, because first mover does not necessarily lock anyone in this space. And we know that historically. And two, because you can't expect a critical infrastructure that is critical not only to our economies, but the ways that our militaries fight, to the way that all of us will communicate with each other in the future. You cannot deploy that in an insecure and non-resilient manner. This is the most critical of critical infrastructures in the future. Like, it is the definition of single point of failure. And you can't sort of put speed ahead of the security truck.
I hope that remains true. But within China, if the horse leaves the barn, it's still a Chinese horse in a Chinese barn. They've got a closed system with a lot of users and very strong levers of control. So that, in fact, they know where the horse is because they've got the surveillance cameras. So they've got this, the world's biggest market with early adapters and a willingness to sort of use these adapters as the guinea pigs, as the test cases without regulation. So you make a very important point. I hope that it holds. But if there's as much at stake as you say there is, we may want to be skeptical about that assumption, even if it's been true up to now.
So if China is racing ahead, what are they using 5G for? What are applications right now, and what are coming online, and what can we learn from that?
Well, China is very proud that it just won the latest International League of Legends team competition. So actually, most of it is faster delivery of mobile lunches and gaming in the short term. But then we get into the kinds of innovation that you were discussing.
I think it is also important here to not look at 5G just as this totally sequestered, standalone issue here. We're basically at the high level talking about, in a connected world, the stuff that fits together that enables a whole host of activities for individuals, consumers, and for the broader critical infrastructure community. And even when we look at the deployment of 5G, it's not like there's a day where 5G gets flipped on and there's just autonomous cars everywhere. When you look between now and 2023, 2024, 2025, what we anticipate in terms of 5G deployment will go from the current 4G LTE build out. You'll have non-standalone 5G deployment where you effectively have 5G on top of the existing 4G infrastructure, and then move down the road closer to 2025, where you have the true true standalone 5G. But even within that, when you're looking at some of what provides the backhaul functionality of that, well, that's the existing fiber network and the new fiber that we're laying. Satellite also plays a role in that. So it's really a connected, holistic ICT infrastructure we need to think about as well. We need to look ahead over the coming decades. And in a world where that infrastructure is going to power more and more than it ever has before, hold more valuable data than it ever has before, how do we have a framework, a risk-informed lens that gives us trust and assurance in the organizations, the components, and the people that play vital roles in that?
Just getting back to Huawei, I'm just wondering, is it practical to purge Huawei equipment from the United States? And if it is, At what cost? As we heard earlier, there are a lot of rural carriers that installed Huawei equipment years ago, and this proposal would require them to go out and physically pull out all this gear. They'd get paid back for that, but it would clearly be very disruptive. And is it solving a problem? I guess if we do this, or is it sort of just a preventive measure, or is it solving a problem that currently exists?
I think when you look at the U.S. right now, we are largely in pretty good shape. All the major carriers have committed to not putting Huawei and other untrusted telecommunications equipment in fifth-generation networks, and it is a smattering of rural carriers across the country that have Huawei in their existing 4G LTE. The estimates vary somewhere between $700 million and $2 billion of what is the cost to rip and replace. But if you talk to the carriers, it's more replace and rip in terms of the sequencing there. But when you think about the U.S. compared to the rest of the world, the total cost to really get Huawei out of our systems in entirety is somewhere in that range. We have spent a lot more on other national security imperatives before. So we are actually in a pretty good spot here right now in the U.S. It's not untenable.
A question, maybe one of the two of you knows the answer to this, I'm not sure. But even if we do this rip and replace, Ericsson and Nokia manufacture most of their transmitters, receivers, routers in the People's Republic of China.
Yeah.
So if we're concerned about surreptitious installation of some vulnerabilities, they're just as open. So my question is this: given all of those vulnerabilities, given the eminent hackability of these systems made by anybody, by almost anybody, and this question about vulnerabilities that you've raised, it seems to me that when we look at these costs and when we talk about the vulnerability from Huawei, the question has to be, and we have certain safeguards we can put in place, right? Germany and the UK are saying that they may let Huawei into the least vulnerable parts of their system because they're confident that they can wall these off technologically. So given that there's some ability, not perfect, to monitor, it seems to me the unasked question is, what is the marginal increase in the ease of hacking and access to the Chinese government of Huawei equipment as opposed to any other equipment? Because if that marginal increase in ease of hacking isn't that great, then we're not actually talking about an enormous vulnerability that comes from Huawei. We're talking about vulnerabilities from these systems generally. Mm-hmm. I don't hear that question asked, and it seems to me like a key question, or do I have a clue about the answer? I don't know if either of you.
Yeah, I think this is really important. It's actually one of the reasons why this says there's more to worry about than just Huawei, right? And I think the answer to your question between sort of marginal benefit of trying to brick out Huawei, both in U.S. networks but also in networks globally, which is sort of part of the U.S. ambition, has to deal with what that network would look like without Huawei. Okay. And so part of what I think my kind of push at this moment is to think about 3 different scenarios that we could get in the U.S. and in the globe. One is this ideal scenario where we are able to somehow undermine Chinese dominance both through Huawei and ZTE in the U.S. and globally in critical infrastructure like 5G. And we're able to gain some leadership in that space. That's sort of like the best case scenario that we were hearing articulated in the first kind of conversation. The second scenario is we get some traction there, but we have a mixed vendor model, of which Huawei is going to be probably one of them, right? Either in the US or abroad to some extent. And then the worst case scenario is Huawei wins this supposed race, of which ill-defined concept of a race, and is the primary or a core critical vendor, both in the US and abroad. In any 3 of those worlds, there's still one really vital security interest for the US. And that's how do you operate securely on inherently insecure networks? Independent of what Huawei is doing in this space, independent of what future we find ourselves in, we have to solve that security and resiliency question of 5G in general. And that has to deal with the software, right? Greater reliance on software. That has to deal with abilities to check, right? Perimeter monitoring versus sort of the pushing outward of the network. This has to deal with concepts around like IoT and like increase in the attack space and the vulnerabilities that brings with it, right? IoT, Internet of Things devices are inherently insecure. These are what are going to be popping onto this. In any of those worlds, that's the fundamental national security.
And that's more a human question that's raised by these technologies than a China question per se, although there's a China dimension of it.
There's a China dimension of it, and I don't want to underplay the ways in which China amplifies security threats to the United States on these networks, but it is not the sole security problem with these networks, right? Even if China were to magically decide it just did not want to compete on 5G, and just for whatever reason said, carry on Finlands, Swedens of the world, like, do your best. Even if we ended up in that world magically, we could snap our fingers, we still have a major security problem with one of the most critical infrastructures in the world coming up for our economies. And so I think we should solve that.
What worries you the most?
Huawei or the underlying?
Underlying.
Underlying. Because I think it just hasn't been, a lot of the security solutions I'm hearing articulated, at least in the public space, are very issue tailored to Huawei. And so I'm less concerned whether we can solve those, and I'm more concerned on whether or not we're looking at this much broader kind of area of risk management and thinking about, okay, so maybe we can do end-to-end encryption. How much bang for a buck does that get us? We can start talking about segmentation of networks. How much bang for a buck does that get us with a vendor like Huawei? And start doing a comprehensive risk analysis versus saying, there's a geopolitical concern over here lurking in this corner. There's real security implications of that. Let's just address that. Because I still think, in the end of the day, we're left with a deeply insecure network.
I'd like to ask Robert, sort of the steps that have been taken to blacklist Huawei, to isolate Huawei in the U.S. have been taken over the last couple of years. At the same time, we've had a trade war with China. And I'm just wondering what you think, like, whether there is a connection between these more aggressive steps against Huawei and the trade war, and if not, how do we go about convincing the American people that these are two separate issues?
Well, there is a broad connection, and then there's a specific connection. The broad connection is that we are now engaged in a global competition with China for influence over security architectures, over trade and investment, very much over the development, marketization, and regulation of tech. That has moved to the foreground. And related to that, also to norms and practices and underlying value systems. And so the Huawei question, like the trade war, is a subset of a global rivalry characterized by deep distrust. And so every aspect of that rivalry reflects on the other. So you can't pull these two things apart. The more specific connection is that the president has twice implied that he might change some of his attitudes toward Huawei if he gets a deal that he wants. This is very difficult because the claims we're making against Huawei are all based on security. They should have nothing to do with a trade deal. And so if we're willing to fold Huawei in, that sounds like we're cynical about our security. It also sounds like we are cynical about the rule of law, because the Eastern District of New York, when it asked the Canadians to arrest the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, we were very careful to say this has been done not by the administration, but this has been done by due process of law. So when the president subsequently implied that he might be willing to let her go for a trade deal, this was then even more strongly interpreted as hostage taking. So there's both the broad geostrategic competition side in which they're linked, and then the president's statements have also implied that there may be a link between how we treat Huawei, including the placing of it on the entities list and these other issues, and a trade deal more generally.
Daniel, I'd like to bring it back to you, just sort of as 5G moves forward. We know what the FCC is proposing, but what other steps do you think the U.S. government can take to secure the networks here forcefully?
Yeah, the first step for us has been extensive stakeholder engagement. CISA, my agency, is not a regulator, and you heard from Chairman Pai earlier, who has a very strict, discrete regulatory mission. So the first step for us is we have an awesome opportunity to have a front row seat for the entirety of the IT sector in the U.S. and the communication sector in the U.S. and bring them together. I think it's really just been the last 18 months where we've had forums like this pop up every single week. I mean, we're the hockey stick of 5G engagement, the circuit, if you will, has just increased exponentially in terms of the interest in it, but there was some level-setting activity that had just not taken place. There was so much activity going around sort of admiring the problem, but not fundamentally laying out understanding from an architectural perspective what 5G actually means. And as Melissa was talking about, understanding just the fundamental job of critical infrastructure protection and enabling and underpinning technologies like 5G. And so we have done extensive work with IT and comms partners to do a lot of just initial level setting activity of understanding at a network component elemental level how 5G architecture work, because we're talking about a largely undeployed network at this point. And I think that's been one of the things that has been most lost in the media, is that this is an issue where the ship has already sailed, and what do we do now? For the most part, we are ahead of this curve enough where we can still make smart, tailored investments, R&D decisions. We can still catalyze risk management activity together. So understanding actually what we're talking about when we say 5G network, standalone versus non-standalone, when we're talking about things like what is the virtualized baseband unit and how software-defined networking can enable that in network slicing, truly understanding that. So that has been sort of, from DHS CISA perspective, much of the last year for us is really digging our teeth into that, because there's still a lot of foundational work that had not been done. Another big activity for us is sort of on the understanding the marketplace dynamics around this. And we want, our goal is pretty simple. We want a risk-informed deployment of 5G technology around the country and the world, but then we also want a vibrant and fair marketplace of 5G providers and manufacturers. And when we're talking things like interoperability, about price transparency and discovery, there is a lot of work there that's so much more nuanced than just Huawei ZTE versus the trusted alternatives. And so we've really started engaging more heavily with organizations out there like the ORAN Alliance, which their goal is within the radio access network portion of 5G, of ensuring that you have true interoperability between those. And that's been, and it's one thing, there's an extensive 3GPP and ITU standard setting process where you'll have 790 pages of really, detailed standards work that talks about frequency and some other privacy issues and down the right. But is it actually practical for that rural provider to take one component from this company here, that's in the core, you've got the Cisco router here, and then you've got the small cell pizza boxes that are in every street corner from a different, can you actually stitch together a diverse and disaggregated 5G network in a way that actually works? There's interoperability, but then there's real interoperability. You hear stories about, the Qualcomm chips, if they're in Huawei kit, the whole system's actually 2 times slower. And so there's great work being done in efforts like the ORAN Alliance of trying to say, no, we truly want to have a free, open, competitive, disaggregated stack. And I think that's a message that has really resonated in our domestic and international engagements is, we have a very defensible position here in the U.S. About Huawei, that we have, intelligence and to support it. We think it was the right decision. Not every country has agreed with us on that. We'll continue to make our risk-informed case. But something almost every country has agreed with is that we can't get into a position where, in the 1980s, IBM controlled the whole stack. And from the servers to the mainframes to the computers to the software to the people coming in to maintain it, that was the communication stack that you had. No one is saying, and then there was this great period of innovation and disaggregation since then. No one is saying, what I really would like in 5G, I really would like to go back to that model. That makes a lot of sense. And so when we're talking to other countries, we've had great risk management success so far, sort of selling that narrative. Maybe we're still going to continue the engagement talking about what vendors are fully trusted and untrusted and why we think they need to make a better risk-informed decision here, and why, if you look at the finite state report or the UK report, but everyone agrees that for something as vitally important, Melissa talking about, this is what is going to power and underpin all critical infrastructure for decades ahead. You can't have a model where it's just top to bottom, you're locked in. And so how do we understand the marketplace of who the players are so that there's true interoperability and a fair, vibrant marketplace for them to compete on the quality and security and resilience of the products they offer? So those have been some of the really exciting activities that DHS and CISA have engaged on, but it's been a real whole of government effort there so far. I think we're early on in the process, though. There's still 5, 6, 7 years until we've really realized all of this.
I found both of your comments reassuring to a degree, but there's still a big question which occurs in U.S.-China relations and internationally across a number of sectors. I'm thinking here about China's infrastructure lending through Belt and Road, which is fairly massive, and we're coming up with smaller pots of money that we want to use to do better quality lending that's probably more sustainable. And the question that your comments were raising was this question of quality, what we're pushing, versus quantity. And it seems to me, in continents like Africa, in South America to a degree, in Central Asia, the model that you've outlined, and you sort of implied the same thing, we are offering quality, an ideal set of circumstances that is expensive and slow coming, whereas China is offering quantity and good enough technology to get started now. including with a lot of lending. And so I'm concerned that in many places we just lose the quality versus quantity in desperately poor areas where this is the one way that they can get enormous benefits, even with all the problems that you've described, relatively cheaply now. And China continues to march ahead, and much of the rest of the world, although not, for example, Western Europe, will go for the Chinese deal. They'll get the data, they'll set the standards. How can we make this argument for something that is ideal, expensive, and slow coming? And how can we prevail in the developing world when China is offering something that is good enough, inexpensive now?
I think some of this comes down to the tactics. We have really forced the conversation within our agency of, we need to think this through the operator's viewpoint, the rural provider, or in the foreign country, the person who runs operations for the third biggest telecom in a G20, G25 fringe country that collectively serves 6 to 7 million people. That's the person you need to think through their eyes. Mm-hmm. And those people are generally well-intentioned. They understand the risk informed argument. They understand the issues we're raising around serious concerns about both the lack of independent judiciary and rule of law, China issues, and just Huawei being a leaky product, et cetera. But then there's a practicality. Rubber hits the road. They actually have to send people and deploy this stuff and pull stuff down and put other stuff in. So there's work to be done just in terms of playbooking and better understanding the mechanics around, hey, here's how we'll work with you to help you understand how this actually is not maybe as scary and daunting as it seems. And you don't need to just say, I'll take the, you guys do it top to bottom, soup to nuts option. And so that's not just sort of a theoretical thing for us. We're actually doing it now. And there's a rural engagement initiative going on in the U.S. where we were out in Denver 2 weeks ago meeting with a rural provider out there who has Huawei in their system. And the owner is a veteran and a self-described patriot. And he said, listen, I'd like a pot of money to help do this. And sounds like it's likely on the way in some capacity. If not, I still want to do it to the extent I can. But you got to help me figure out how to do it. And that's what really illuminated for us is, rip and replace is the wrong order. He's like, I have to serve people. I can't just rip and then figure out what I do.
He wants to do it for security reasons or quality reasons?
He wants to do it for security reasons. He believes the argument and wants to work with us. But he wants to understand sort of the sequencing of how you phase things in and get to a more trusted place and have confidence that he's not just pulling a bunch of stuff out of the ground and then all of a sudden his customers have reliability issues. And so that's where we can come together. We can help build out some of those playbooking and on the tactical levels of how you actually do that. So I do have some degree of confidence there. And also when you look at what a lot of the conversations going on in Europe and across the world, whether it's 5G or just 4G LTE, a lot of the radio access network around the world is just going to need to be replaced because it's old. And so we can think of this not necessarily as this scary moment in the sand of either this is your moment of reckoning or you're going to go down the good path or the bad path. But hey, right here this year for the 15% of your radio access network that you need to replace, let's help make a risk-informed decision here. And there are economic concerns which are still troubling, but when you pose it like that, when there's a huge cost of just manual labor of doing that, and so the physical equipment is actually only a fraction of that, and so 15% of 40%, all of a sudden of the 15% they're just doing this year, you can sort of get people through the operator's lens on board and comfortable with, yeah, this year I have some decisions to make. I need to phase out 15%, and that maybe is a little bit more expensive, but it's trusted. But in the grand scheme of things, let's go for that. That is much different than sort of this is your moment of reckoning. So we can do good work on sort of the tactical level, I think.
I want to just get back to Melissa and your policy paper on there's more to worry about than just Huawei. And you said that you were more concerned about the underlying infrastructure that's being developed than Huawei itself. Just what are you most concerned about? What is most vulnerable? What poses the greatest threats to individuals, to institutions, to the United States as this network gets developed with this very broad kind of surface of area that's vulnerable?
Yeah. So I think to sort of clarify that, I am most concerned about it because I think we have too much focus on Huawei. So I think they're important in different ways, but I think we're just missing the forest through the trees. In terms of areas of concern when it comes to 5G, I think there are a couple. I don't think, for example, looking much bigger picture, 60,000 feet, I don't think we have a really good understanding about how 5G networks in with other critical infrastructures. So these are broader questions about resiliency for society at large, right? How do you maintain energy kind of production or service if your 5G network goes down, for example, right? And these are broader questions about whole of government, whole of society solutions to cybersecurity vulnerabilities, of which one anchor of that will be 5G. That's not unique to 5G. That's a concern with 4G as well. We don't have a really great understanding about how these things interface and the ways that we manage risk at that level between critical infrastructures. More on the kind of 5G, this kind of upcoming technology, I think there's a couple areas that I find particularly concerning. One is the further shift towards software. And I think there are important solutions that are out there that are being developed. And I know that if you talk to specific carriers, for example, they're a little bit more optimistic about some of the tools they can leverage from 4G and apply them to 5G. But I think that we need to have a more robust understanding of what security in a software sense means as we play this out. The other one for me is really, it's the Internet of Things. Right. This is the sort of punch of 5G. This is what it gets us, is this better interconnectivity of a lot of devices. The Internet of Things has dogged us now for a good 10 years, kind of in terms of being incredibly insecure. Yeah. That's a problem not only for the security of 5G, but those devices can be leveraged for things like DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, right, against other types of targets. So I think there's a real magnifying effect coming out of 5G that I find particularly concerning.
I just want to bring this down to a personal level about your own personal digital security. And are you wary of some of these things? And just how do you practice the best hygiene to protect your own data, your privacy? All of you. I mean, but just why don't you just talk about that? Because I think these are hugely important developments in policy world, but I think we're all trying to make our own lives more secure. So why don't we just talk about that a little bit?
Want to head down the line?
Short answer is yes. There's sort of two different buckets. One is we live in this world where for cyber critical infrastructure and how it all interconnects, we're thinking about advanced persistent threats and nation state attacks and finding points of leverage and managed service providers and a lot of consequence modeling and so systemic risk stuff that is new and maybe an evolved threat landscape ingredient from say 7-8 years ago. Yeah. And we need to keep doing that. On the other hand is there's just all these basics that the country isn't doing. And you've seen recently children not going to school because of ransomware attacks. You've seen people turned away from hospitals because of ransomware attacks. And not because we didn't do some crazy systemic modeling to do, but just because 10-year-old technology and 15-year-old security best practices that are non-controversial weren't deployed. Mm-hmm. And how do you balance both of those? I think the answer is you just have to keep doing both.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I think I'm also similarly concerned with the fact that a lot of the time when we see these sort of blazing instances in the news, what we're actually looking at is something that the solution was already there for, right? And had been there for a while. So it's a question of how do you implement at scale across antiquated and diverse technology, right? And that concerns me. I think on a personal, which I think was sort of the
right. Like, are you going to use these?
I am clearly wearing an Internet of Things device. You're not wrong. I think for me, there's sort of a variety of risk that you would be concerned with. I think there is like a packet of basic cyber hygiene any individual can do when dealing with devices, right? Update your technology, right? Things of this nature that are not overly complicated and yet are surprisingly underutilized. I think just having a better sense, and this was something I know I push with friends and family, a better sense of what your technology is doing, right? Because I think often people don't understand the security implications or even how to secure something or think about security and personal hygiene because it's like a magic box in their hand. Like, wait, you mean this app is on in the background? It's sending information? It's like, yes, that app is on in the background. It's sending information. So just basic education and I think hygiene standards can be huge on the individual level. And then I think the other part for me is there's a little bit of a civic responsibility here. So I study a lot of small countries historically where there's really strong civic responsibility to kind of the state, right, and to the national interest to a certain extent. And I think people should be concerned if a device they own has been compromised and is being used to leverage a DDoS attack against your own government or another government, right? That's basically someone holding your technology hostage to carry out malicious activity. And you should be concerned with that as an individual and want to take proper cyber hygiene tasks at hand to prevent that. So I think there's also, you can't prevent everything, but you can sort of take some basic steps, gain some basic awareness, and think about your technology as part of this broader ecosystem.
my brief thoughts will be far less useful. I try to spend as little time in cyberland as possible and to teach my children that, in fact, you do have the choice of not living on the internet. I write with pencils on yellow legal pads, and I read paper novels. So you can opt out a lot of this. I'm not on any social media. As an institution at the Wilson Center, when we travel to China or Russia, we are told not to take our own phones, and it's very easy to get a burner computer to take with us. And every year we all have to take and retake not one but two different computer security courses. And that actually does, while it's highly redundant, it also keeps your antenna pretty alert. And I think that it becomes very easy to spot phishing attacks. So you can do a lot for institutional integrity. But when I read about all the promises of 5G, they've yet to raise a problem that I'm trying to solve. I don't really need my car to talk to my refrigerator.
Right. I think any final thoughts? I think we have a few more minutes. Is that right?
I had a question, mostly for Melissa. Given that you are mostly concerned about the problems that this technology poses to everybody anyway, you're more worried about that than Huawei. Do you see any room for cooperation? We've been speaking about Chinese tech as though it's wholly demonized and it's wholly competitive. But can we not work with China and other international players to try to answer some of these questions that you've raised? If China's moving ahead with some of the hardware, but if Cisco and a lot of American companies are going to remain ahead with the software, are there any, and I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but I'm just wondering if we're forgetting to ask the question, if there's room to cooperate on standards, on regulations, to tone down some of the wholly demonizing language. This is not just a battle between good and evil, and to try to cooperate internationally. Do you see any prospect for that, or are we too distrustful or too far apart?
I think there's a couple kind of areas of concern. I think Daniel makes a really good point when he points out there are governments out there that have over 14 years of history trying to rectify, I'm thinking the UK here, for example, trying to deploy kind of Huawei technology at scale in a reliable, secure, resilient manner. And their 5th annual report that just came out this year, once again, came to the conclusion they just didn't have a good degree of confidence. And that's 14 years, so I do think that is concerning.
But that's because of the weakness of the software or malign intentions?
Software firmware, it's unclear. So I have not seen any evidence in the public space that would claim that the Chinese government is out there masquerading in sort of 5G Huawei technology, building in backdoors, shutting things down. Here's a kill switch there. Here's a vendor backdoor here, right? That is an area of concern, but it's a lot of speculation at this point in the public space. I do think there are ample opportunities for that, given how buggy, technical term, that code is, right? And not just for China, to be clear. If you have really buggy code, that's an opportunity for any malicious actor. So I think that's worth pointing out. We keep saying the word China over and over. That's not the only malicious actor a country like the United States or like-minded states would be concerned about. So I think there's that concern. I do think there's areas for opportunity when we start doing much more of a risk management, kind of comprehensive thought process about what this threat space looks like, because I think that allows us to sort of say, in what ways does Huawei introduce insecurity that is just unacceptable? And in what ways, at cost, can we mitigate some of those concerns? Right? And these are questions around end-to-end encryption, virtual private networks, VPNs, segmentation, right? Questions about building resiliency, kind of backups, things of that nature. And I think as soon as we start actually operationalizing that, a lot of the work that Daniel is talking about, we have a better sense of where we can work with Huawei, where we can do that and mitigate the risk, and where we just absolutely can't. But I don't think we've done that nuance yet. There's a lot of like Huawei or no one kind of mentality versus that much more nuanced risk.
If we're only having a binary conversation about China bad, we aren't going to be able to achieve the security and resilience results we want. At the same time, the U.S. government has not been too apologetic about what our assessment of the strategic intent there is. And we did a public webinar this past February on APT-10 Cloud Hopper, which is a Chinese state-backed campaign to leverage managed service providers as an ultimate point of leverage to steal what's likely tens of billions of dollars of intellectual property across every industry of dozens of countries. And so that's something that we have put out publicly and with a boatload of intelligence behind, and we're not going to shy away from that. It's strategic intent that has been demonstrated, and you talked about BGP hijacking and rerouting of internet traffic. We're not going to pretend that doesn't exist. But at the same time, if we're only trying to sell that narrative, we're going to not do the operational stuff as well.
Do we have time for questions? Yes? Okay. Over there, you?
So we talked about it a little bit earlier, and it's outside Hi, I'm Amanda Rankin. I'm a defense fellow, I'm a congressional defense fellow. My question is regarding the deployment of Starlink satellites and OneWeb satellites producing, global Wi-Fi coverage. If it's outside the scope of this conversation, please let me know. But I have a question as to whether a more innovative, or not even innovative, but a better or more effective policy solution at this point would be to work on, rather than ripping out and replacing all of this hardware infrastructure all across the country, would it be better then to build new infrastructure or to prepare everyone to use Wi-Fi as provided from space, just the way we do with GPS? Thank you.
I think satellite and fiber need to be huge parts of the 5G conversation generally. And we work with the satellite segment within the Communications Sector Coordinating Council. Even when you're talking about 5G connectivity, when you have rural areas where maybe you don't quite have that connectivity as we do the build out, satellite is a great option there in terms of filler in between, where depending on the throughput that you need, you might actually have no discernible difference in terms of the functionality of the connectivity at all. And so that it likely is an area where an enhanced partnership and engagement with the satellite, I want to say industry because it's sort of a few different segments, but would be worthwhile just because it's part of the equation that's not going away.
All the way in the back.
Dakota, I'm at Georgetown University. To Robert Daly's question earlier, I was wondering as to why developing NIST standards for 5G technology is an appropriate response to untrusted network deployment and formalizing a way to make that network deployment trusted. It seems like advanced persistent threats don't care if it's Huawei tech or Nokia tech deployed. It seems like they'll still be able to access those networks. And so I'm wondering why our conversation isn't technology-based rather than the kind of great power competition conversation we're seeing here.
So I think a large amount of the conversation actually has been technology-based, right, in terms of thinking about what the structure of 5G is, the technological realities of that. I think you're absolutely right in the sense that if you are a malicious actor of significant skill and you have a strategic imperative to compromise a network, for whether that's espionage or sabotage, any of those two, you're not necessarily going to care what's sort of the operator, the vendor of that network, except for some of those are easier targets than others, right? So if you're looking for a weak link, your opportunity in is bugs, right? These are these backdoors. So I do think if you are a malicious, persistent actor, it is in your best interest to have your adversaries operating on very insecure networks, right? Because those are your entrances in. And we see time and time again with sort of particularly very qualified actors that they go for the really low-hanging fruit, right? They're going to enter a casino's internal network through their fish tank thermometer. They're not going to go head-on into that network. They find that kind of much more sort of porous opportunity and go for it. So I think that's like another reason why we should be much more concerned about operating securely across the stack, whatever that stack is. But at the same time, and I think this has been pointed out, we shouldn't just wave our hands and say, oh, well, I guess we've lost the battle around the stack and we should just go really buggy.
So we're running a little bit over time. One more question, and then we'll be done. Right here.
Hi, Jim Saltis from Nobles. So the mobile carriers are already rolling out 5G, and I know you can stop them in terms of $8.99 and say here's the equipment you're allowed to use, but they're deploying it now. I mean, AT&T is utilizing FirstNet to put the radio equipment on their towers anyway as they're rolling that out. So what power do you have to actually stop it when you say why we should wait? Well, I don't think you really can stop them. The commercial market's going to take over and they're going to push it out. So what power do you have to stop it from really being deployed in the US?
I think as a baseline, we feel pretty good about the deployment for the major carriers in the U.S. And so it's not some sort of let's just rest on our laurels and dust off our hands, but certainly from a risk management lens, we feel like on the front end of this deployment, we're in a pretty advantageous position right now. In terms of your specific question about sort of what are the levers that can be pulled to influence what ICT is procured and deployed into the field right now, or for the federal government, which has a host of functions that matter to the American people. There's sort of 8 or 9 different levers right now that all touch different parts of it. There on the federal side, there was the NDA Section 889, which we discussed earlier a little bit. There was a newly created Federal Acquisition Security Council, which is going to bring together the civilian government led by DHS, DOD, and the IC to issue potential exclusion and removal orders in a coordinated fashion across those 3 domains for supply chain risks. And so that's a new development that we haven't had before. There is the existing CFIUS process, which has to do with foreign investment, but another lever there as well. There are sort of the export controls and entity list authorities that the Department of Commerce has. Department of Commerce also issued, the president signed an executive order on May 15th on securing the ICT supply chain that will have forthcoming rulemaking by the Department of Commerce and how they want to implement that to potentially ban private sector ICTS transactions to include services as well. And so that's another lever that fits into that quiver. And so I think you sort of stitch all of those together, and there is a number of ways that both for what is allowed to go into the federal digitally connected enterprise and then what the private sector is able to buy and deploy of ways to influence that, some incentive-based, some regulatory-based as well. Recognize the fact that I didn't just name sort of one clean policy. I named 6 or 7 different things, but there are tools that are out there.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you.